Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. According to this year's Kids Count Data Book, a report released annually by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, New Mexico ranks 50th in child well-being. Joining us to share more insight about New Mexico's ranking is Amber Wallin, Executive Director of New Mexico Voices for Children. Amber, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks for having me here, Anthony, and thanks for covering something that's so important.
Obviously an important issue, but to start off, I'd like to give our audience a chance to learn more about New Mexico Voices for Children. Can you share with us your mission?
Yes, absolutely. Well, New Mexico Voices for Children, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit that does research and data and policy work around economic, health, and education issues that relate to kids and families in New Mexico. And our mission is really to improve public policies and improve child well-being and child equity in the state.
Now, with this last place ranking in child well-being for New Mexico, due to the Kids Count data book that ranked New Mexico last in the country with this, what are some of the factors that you noticed that stood out the most?
Well, that's a great question. And, you know, it might be helpful to give a little bit of background on the Kids Count program for folks who may not know what it is. Kids Count is, as you said, it's led by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and it's a state-by-state and a nationwide effort to track children and family and community well-being across all of the states. And it's done using standard government-collected data. Most of it comes from the Census Bureau, and it's in four main areas: economics, education, health, and then a broad category of indicators that we call family and community well-being. And so those are important areas to track. You know, we know that there's a lot of different facets of life that impact a child and a child's well-being. And so what the data does is it takes a look at what kind of opportunities are available to kids. And I think that's really the most important aspect of the Kids Count program. It's not so much about the rankings, which are always about how New Mexico fares as compared to other states, but it really is digging into the data and looking at how is New Mexico doing and what kind of opportunities are we really providing for our kids and our families to thrive and reach their full potential.
One of the things that stood out to me when I was reviewing the data on this report for New Mexico's data sheet was how big of an impact that poverty had on New Mexico's rankings and the opportunities that may not be available for a lot of children in the state. What are some things in poverty that New Mexico faces that seem to be such a big challenge?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, what the data shows is that clearly we have a ways to go when it comes to creating better opportunities for all of our kids. And as you said, childhood poverty is one of those things that looms large in New Mexico and looms large not just in the Kids Count rankings and index, but really in child well-being overall. So right now we're ranked 48th in the nation when it comes to childhood poverty, and that's 26% of our kids that are currently living in poverty. Now, that's one thing to think about that number, and we know that that's so many kids in our state and our communities who don't have those opportunities that they need to thrive. So that holds us back in a lot of different areas. One of the things that I'd say about childhood poverty, it's holding us back, and we're also making improvements in that area. So long term, and I think that's again an important thing to look at when we look at the data, looking at long term, how is it changing? So our poverty rate among children has actually decreased by about 20,000 kids. So there's 20,000 fewer kids living in poverty now than were a decade ago. And so I think that's important to look at. We're still ranked poorly. We still have so much to do to create better opportunities. And we're also starting to go down that road now, starting to create opportunities that raise economic security for families with kids in them.
So what are some things that you think state lawmakers did to address this issue to help improve childhood poverty in the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I'd say that we've really seen some big steps when it comes to building economic security for families and children in our state. And so, just in the past few years, New Mexico has taken some really important steps. We've, in 2019, increased the minimum wage for workers in our state. We've also passed a number of tax policies that are really targeted towards supporting workers with families. So we more than doubled a tax credit that goes to low and lower middle income workers. Almost all of that, almost all claimants are workers with children. So that's great. This legislative session in 2022, we passed one of the nation's first state level child tax credits, building off of how successful the federal child tax credit was, building that further in New Mexico. And so we've seen some great advancements there. We've also limited some predatory lending and created other economic programs that are really boosting opportunities for families. And so that's important. But then alongside that, when we were seeing progress, especially the building of economic opportunity for families with kids, the same time we saw COVID set a lot of our families back. And so the data also reveal that. They reveal that even as we were making long-term advancements in child and family well-being, that COVID stymied that progress a bit. And so we know that there's still work yet to be done.
Okay, now employment seemed to be an issue for a lot of families. 34% of children had parents who lacked employment in the state, according to New Mexico's data sheet in this report. So can you kind of share with us, like, what are some of the big challenges families are facing when it comes to employment in New Mexico? Because this is a time where a lot of employers are complaining that they can't find staff and are having trouble hiring staff.
Yep. Yeah, that's such a great question, and it's such a timely question. And I'll say a couple things. And one thing I just want to share, and it's a bit, you and I have talked a lot about data over the years, Anthony. And so just to give some more information for viewers, the Kids Count rankings are based on older data. And that's always the case. It's always a little bit delayed, but just as COVID impacted economics for our families, we know that it also impacted data collection. And so what we're talking about in the rankings and in the data in the Kids Count data book, the data is actually mostly coming from years prior to 2019. So it's mostly 2016 through 2020. And I point that out just because it's important, again, to look at those trends, look at those areas where we've long had challenges, look at how we're doing in those areas. And to your point about employment, I think that's, as you said, poverty is a major factor in a lot of these different indicators. And family employment, family economic situation looms large for children and families. If children's parents aren't working or not bringing in high enough wages, they may have trouble affording food. Those children may go to school without breakfast in their bellies. They may have a harder time focusing on tests. They may, and those repercussions ripple out and through a whole child's life. So family economic status and employment is really key. And I'd say one of the big barriers that we've seen historically in New Mexico when it comes to parental employment is access to childcare and access to affordable and high quality childcare. For many years, New Mexico was ranked worst in the nation among adults who worked full-time year-round in poverty. And so what that means is that, as our state has really made leaps and bounds improvements in supporting our childcare industry, what that means is if families can't afford it, then there are still big barriers and families aren't able to be fully employed. And so there again, I lift up some key things that we've seen, some important trends. One thing that COVID showed us was that if the childcare industry doesn't function, then a whole economy can collapse and it can make mothers withdraw from the workforce. And it means that workers can't go to work or can't do so reliably. And so one of the things that we saw over the summer was that the state took steps to expand childcare assistance to most families, to nearly all families in the state. That's big, and that's really big for parental employment. And alongside that, we've seen a lot of improvements when it comes to early childhood. That's important not just from a brain development standpoint, but also really, as you pointed out, as an economic support. And so that's another area where the data is lagging a bit behind the policy progress, but I think there's reason to hope that New Mexico is building the foundation for a better ranking and for a brighter future.
Okay, now you mentioned just being able to afford childcare. But what about just having access to childcare? There's a lot of rural communities in New Mexico that may not have a childcare facility within driving distance in their regions. So how is the state doing with this issue?
That's absolutely right. And that's a challenge that so many families face. And it's not, as you said, it's not just an urban challenge. Maybe disproportionately, it's a rural challenge for so many of our communities. And I'd say for too many years, New Mexico and all states were really behind recognizing how fundamentally important those first 5 years are. Over 95% of brain development occurs in those early years of a child's life. And so that's important. We need to invest in those years so children are better prepared to enter school. But just as importantly, we need that economic support for families. And if there's not a child care center, parents can't work, children can't go to pre-K, you can't have high quality childcare. And so especially in our rural areas, the building up of infrastructure has been crucial to get childcare workers, to get childcare centers. And that's not a challenge. That's something that happens in 1 or 2 years. It's really a generational thing. It's a decade thing. And so I'd say New Mexico is really, over the past few years, we've been gradually increasing our investments in early education, not just for affordability for families, but that also means supporting those small businesses that are really disproportionately run by women and women of color, that are local businesses in our communities that are serving as childcare facilities. It's also ensuring that our workers are paid the wages that they need. You can't build up a childcare workforce if workers are themselves barely getting by. And so we know that wages are a big part of that. And then it's affordability for families. But all those things go into it. And just a couple of years ago, New Mexico created one of the nation's first early childhood focused cabinet level departments. So I'd say that's a major step forward in ensuring we're building up that infrastructure. And then we've seen increases in funding with, the next one is on the horizon. It's one that policymakers aren't making. It's one that New Mexico voters will get a chance to make come November 8th, when they get to vote on a constitutional amendment to put further funding into building up our childcare infrastructure.
Now, you mentioned the constitutional amendment that voters will have a chance to weigh in on that could drastically impact funding with early childhood education. Can you kind of share with us some insight on what researchers and policymakers are saying, how this can make a difference?
Absolutely. Well, what we know is that those first few years are critical. They're not just tied to being able to read in kindergarten. They're tied to high school graduation rates. They're tied to lifetime earning as adults. And when in New Mexico, we know we face generational challenges when it comes to economics. That's important to think about too. And what voters will have a chance to consider, will have a chance to vote on the back of their ballots come November 8th, is constitutional amendment number 1. And what that would do is that would take a very small percentage, just over 1% of additional amount from our state's permanent school fund, sometimes known as the Land Grant Permanent Fund. And that money, which amounts to about $250 million a year, that money would be invested in mostly early childhood care and education services, and then also into our K-12 education system. And so those are all big numbers, and talking about care and education in K-12, but really what that means is that means that much more money to pay our childcare workers living wages. And so parents aren't seeing that turnover. I have 2 young children myself, and I know what that is to see such turnover. We're having childcare centers who are better able to stay in business. We're having families better able to afford the sometimes enormous cost of childcare, which in New Mexico costs more than college tuition. So that means our parents can get back in the workforce, especially our moms of color, really important. And it also means additional spending that's available for our classrooms, to raise our teacher wages, to ensure that our school buildings aren't crumbling and that our kids have the books and computers that they need. So, it's one thing to talk about a $26 billion fund that we're going to pull a tiny more portion of if voters approve it, but it really does lead to long-lasting benefits for New Mexico's kids and families in our communities as well.
Now, you mentioned paying child care workers a living wage. New Mexico lawmakers took steps this past legislative session to also increase funding and opportunities for those who want to go back to college. With the opportunity scholarship in New Mexico, state lawmakers have touted this is a great opportunity for New Mexicans to go back to college, but we don't know how sustainable that fund is and the funding for that opportunity. So how concerned are you about the sustainability of that fund?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it also kind of goes back to your question about how are we building up an infrastructure that supports this progress? And so that higher ed piece is critical, even when we're talking early ed and when we're talking K-12 education in classrooms. How are we ensuring that New Mexico is building a pipeline and building a really qualified workforce that is drawing in businesses that want to relocate to New Mexico? And so I think your point about the Opportunity Scholarship is really well made. It's critical that we're funding higher education as well. We're keeping New Mexico's brightest as they're leaving high school. They're able to afford higher ed. They're able to find jobs in the state. It's all very closely connected. And one thing I'll mention real quick, I was just reading a report earlier today that showed that 17% of New Mexico's higher ed students are first generation students, and so that first generation college students. And so that's great because that's a great indicator that we're building economic opportunity through generations. And so that's exactly what we want to see, right? We want to see opportunity for all of our kids in our state. And so I think the data is reflecting that. But to your point about funding, that's critical. Last week we had new state revenue estimates come out that showed that New Mexico has a record-setting surplus right now. So that's wonderful, right? We know that that's great. And we also know that part of that is temporary. So part of that is due to federal investments and the impacts of that. And then part of it's also because we're in a boom portion of our state's boom and bust kind of volatile oil and gas revenue cycle. About 2/3 of that money comes from the fact that we're in a high point of oil and gas. But we also know that that revenue source is not only not stable because it goes up and down every few years. And we've seen that, and you've seen that every few years our state has a lot of money, then 3-4 years forward and we don't have any money again. And so it's really critical, to your point, that those investments that we're making right now as a state, that those are able to continue, that it's not just done during times of surplus, that we're really thinking generationally. And how are we ensuring that we have diversified revenues to sustain these critical programs now and in the future?
Okay, now we talked a lot about early childhood education, and obviously that needs a lot of discussion, not only from folks in our communities, but also our state lawmakers, and how we're moving forward with addressing that issue in New Mexico. We'll see how voters weigh in November with this issue on funding early childhood education. But I want to talk with you just about education in general. There is some concerning data here with this Kids Count data book about high schoolers not graduating on time, 25%. This is from data from 2018-19. So can you kind of share with us what things do you think are being addressed right now with this issue and what's lacking?
Yeah, that's a great question again. And I think the education one is always a hard one to handle because again, it's not something that just a 1 year or 2 year of investments will turn it around. It's something that we have to invest in long term. And as you know, years ago, the state lost an education funding lawsuit, and the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. And that said that our state had historically not funded education nearly to the levels that are needed, especially when it comes to creating programs that support English language learners and students that are low income, Native American students. And so what we know is that not only for way too many years did we underfund our classrooms and underpay our teachers and under-resource our kids, but also when you have, New Mexico, 75% of our children in New Mexico are children of color. We have to be creating resources that are creating opportunities for children of color and our incredible Native American students, our English language learners, the 26% of the child population that's living in poverty. We have to create classrooms that are working for those folks. Otherwise, we're not going to progress as a state. And so I think that was an important step. And since then, really starting in 2019, we've seen major investments in New Mexico education. We've significantly increased pay for teachers, significantly invested in our classrooms. I think to your question about the data, something that's critical, because that indicator is so troubling, 1 in 4 students not graduating on time. And I'd also say, again, looking at the data long term, what you see in that one in particular, about a decade ago in 2011, 37% of our high schoolers were not graduating on time. And so it's another area where we are making progress. And I think that's important to hold on to just because I'm a child of New Mexico. I was born and raised in New Mexico. I went to New Mexico schools. My mom was a public school teacher, and so I know what it's like to hear those rankings again and again and feel like, well, we're never going to improve, or we're doing this and it's not improving. And so the reason I bring up those areas where we are is because it is critical to see that tie in areas like education and some of the health indicators, early childhood indicators, where we've made investments and we're seeing improvement, even if the ranking doesn't show it, because oftentimes it might not, because it's just compared to other states.
Well, New Mexico lawmakers certainly took steps to address salaries for New Mexico teachers and staff, but there's still the issue of keeping teachers and staff in schools, in the profession. We saw teachers during the pandemic and staff leave the profession in numbers. New Mexico had to call in the National Guard to help with filling classrooms at some times in the place of a teacher or staff member. So I'd like to hear from you, what are some things that the state still needs to address to ensure that they have a teaching workforce and staff that's needed in schools?
Yeah, and it's you said it. We saw during the pandemic what that can do, just like childcare. If you have a system that's critical, absolutely critical, both childcare and K-12 education are critical for our parents, our kids, our workforce. COVID highlighted the weaknesses in any systems and really highlighted what it does to a system when it's been underinvested in for so long. And so we saw, parents like myself who were homeschooling for over a year, who had young children at home. It was a desperate situation, and it really highlighted how critical and how absolutely just essential our teacher workforce is. And so I think moving forward, it's supporting our workers, our child care, our K-12 workers. It's increasing those salaries and continuing to do so. For too many years, New Mexico is ranked near the bottom in teacher salaries, so we're progressing in that area. And I think it's also building up school staff and school capacity, because a school system is more than the teachers that are just in the classroom. It's the administrative workers, and it's the school counselors, it's school nurses. In New Mexico, we know it's especially social workers in the schools. When children in New Mexico go to school, they're there for 8 hours, but they're carrying with them all of the challenges in their life, which we know in New Mexico also includes food security challenges and really high rates of childhood trauma. And so all of those things that schools can provide in a more wraparound way that support those children, not just in their educational goals, are key. And, it all goes back to a couple of things. It goes back to long-term building of infrastructure, really robust funding that's required to do that and required to pay those folks the salaries that they need and deserve. And it also, again, comes back to building that workforce pipeline. And so it's why higher ed is a really key piece of that, why we're ensuring that New Mexico students can afford school, that they're not taking on massive debt, and that you have higher ed programs that are able to really robustly support students, whether that's in 4-year programs, 2-year programs, but that there's a variety of options, and those are not just available in our major cities, but that is throughout the state as well.
Okay, we just have about 3 minutes left with you. We spent a lot of time on education, but I do want to talk about health and some alarming statistics with this. 34% of teens in New Mexico are overweight or obese. This is according to 2019-20 data. So what are some things that you think the state can address with this issue or may already be implementing?
Mm-hmm. I think that's an important point to bring up, because we know it's a factor in a lot of children's health issues. And so that's a newer indicator in the Kids Count Index, but it was added because of the ties into children's health. And so I think one of the things that New Mexico could and needs to be doing is really focusing on food security. Now, food security is a broader thing. When folks hear it at first, they think that means folks don't have enough to eat, and that's absolutely a part of it. But it also has to do with having access to healthy foods. And as I mentioned, 8 hours of our children's days are spent in school. And so the state's recent focus, and I say recent, in the past couple of years, the state's made big moves in this area to ensure that our kids not only have enough to eat, but they're also able to access healthy food. And that's a big problem in rural areas as well, ensuring we have grocery stores, ensuring that kids and families in our rural areas have access to things other than they may just be able to buy at a convenience store is really critical. And again, it goes back to long-term investments in the infrastructure that's required to move food from our farms to our schools and to our communities. And it's really long-term investments. There's no quick fixes on here or any of it, but I think our state really is making some critical progress and that it's laying the groundwork for a better future overall.
Okay, so I want to talk about family and community being observed with this report. Of course, there are some successes with this issue, but children in single parent families, we do know there are some successes with this, but still 43% of children in New Mexico live in a single parent family. How does this impact the well-being of a child?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways you can look at it. There's the way of looking at it from, we know as an emotional support standpoint, having two parents in the home means two more adults that can provide emotional and social emotional growth opportunities for children. So that's critical. And we know that too many children in our state, we rank highly amongst children who have had an adult incarcerated. So there's different reasons why children may only have a single parent at home. But the factor that looms the largest in this indicator is how does that impact the economic security of our kids? And that's where most of the outcomes are related to, is that in a single parent household, there's one income versus two incomes that can be used to help support a child to ensure there's enough food to eat, that there's maybe access to pre-K, or that there's a tutor program if needed. So I think that that's the biggest thing, is that that means that 43% of children in our state are facing that additional economic challenges that we have said, that looms so large and influences so many other factors for our kids. So that economic piece is so critical.
Amber Wallin is Executive Director for New Mexico Voices for Children. Amber, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks again, Anthony. Appreciate you.
And we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.